Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be showing you how to create these two watercolor paintings. So the materials you'll be needing are of course your watercolor set, and you'll also need some kind of paper that can handle lots of layers of water. I'm using my Campap Arto 300 GSM cold pressed watercolor paper for this, and I'm also going to be using a scrap piece of the paper to test my colors on. You'll also need a tissue paper to lift up the paint off of the paper if you need to, and I also use an extra tissue paper for wiping my brush. And you'll need paint brushes. I use round and flat paint brushes, and I also use this palette for mixing my colors. I'll be using a regular cello tape for taping my paper down, but I'll suggest you to use masking tape or washi tape, and I'll be using this clipboard for taping my paper on, but you can also tape it down on your desk if you want to. So first you'll need to tape down the paper onto a surface. Since these kinds of paintings require a lot of water, taping down the paper can minimize the warping and buckling that can happen while painting. Since I'm using cello tape, I stick it onto a cloth several times to remove some of the tackiness of the tape. Otherwise, the paper may tear once I start to peel off the tape. But if you're using washi tape or masking tape, you don't have to do this step. I pre-mixed all my colors that I'll be needing before starting. For the first painting, I mixed some ultramarine blue with some crimson red in about equal amounts. First, wet the surface of the paper by applying water with a clean wet brush. If you see any pools of water gathering on the surface, soak it up with a tissue paper or a damp brush. Go ahead with a light wash of your color and start adding it to the wet paper while leaving out the area in the middle. This is the wet on wet technique, and it creates a smooth blend between the color and the white of the paper. I'm using quick dabbing motions for this so that I get cloud-like shapes. Keep adding more and more color while the paint is still wet. If you see that the paint is covering up the areas that you would like to be white, simply go in with a clean wet brush and push some of the paint away from that area. Once you're happy with how the colors look, let the paint dry. For the second painting, I mixed cerulean blue with a little bit of viridian hue. I begin by adding a very light wash of this color around the middle of the paper and pull it around the edges to blend it into the white of the paper so that I don't get a harsh edge. This is the wet on dry technique. Next, I add some cobalt blue mixed with a little bit of viridian hue to the top section of the paper, and I blend it into the lighter section in around the middle. And while that layer is still wet, I go over it with my mixture of cobalt blue and viridian hue once again to intensify the colors a bit. And as I advance to the top of the paper, I use more cobalt blue and less viridian hue so that I can gradually get darker and darker at the top. I do the same with the bottom section of the paper, but I'm using a mixture of cerulean blue with viridian hue in this case. Again, keep adding more and more color while the paint is still wet to intensify the colors, and let the layer dry. Coming back to the first painting, now we are going to add our second layer. For this, I use the same mixture of ultramarine blue and crimson red, but this time with a little bit more of ultramarine blue. Re-wet the surface of the paper. Make sure that the previous layer is completely dry and use gentle brush strokes, otherwise this step will become a mess. Then I repeated the process while making sure to leave out some areas so that the previous layer can show through. Make sure that you preserve the white of the paper in this step. Keep adding more color while the paint is still wet. If an area is completely dry, go ahead and re-wet that area and add more paint if you want to. If you see harsh edges forming, use a damp brush and use dabbing motions around the edges to soften them. You can also keep some harsh edges if that's the look that you want. You can use a scrunched up tissue paper and lift up some of the wet paint to create additional cloud-like shapes. Let this layer dry completely once you're happy with it. For the second painting, I again wet the surface of the paper and add a second layer of the cobalt blue and viridian color mixture, following the slant of the previous layer while leaving out some areas to create subtle clouds in the top section of the paper. And I also add a mixture of cobalt blue with more of the viridian hue this time to the bottom section of the wet paper to darken the value. Coming back to the first painting, I used the same mixture again, but this time added more of the ultramarine blue and just a tiny bit of black to darken my color. And I repeated the process, mostly focusing on the corners and the sides of the paper where my darkest colors would be. Once you're happy with how everything looks, let everything dry completely. Now for the second painting, again I mixed some cobalt blue, viridian hue and a little bit of black and repeated the process, re-wetting the paper and adding darker values mostly towards the top of the paper. You can keep adding as many layers as you like and darken the colors as much as you want to. And once you're happy, let everything dry completely before you add the stars. For this step, I'm using my white watercolor paint, but I would recommend you to use an opaque white paint like white gouache or white acrylic paint. I added the white paint mixed in with a little bit of water onto the toothbrush and started to flick it onto the surface of my paper. You can also add some variation to the way you add the stars by going closer to the surface while flicking the toothbrush or going farther away to create stars that are farther away from each other. Now it's time to add the mountain ranges. With the darkest color mixture that I made for the first painting, I'm going in and outlining my mountains, and I'm also adding these triangular like shapes and filling them in. And yeah, you can kind of follow what I'm doing in the video. I also make a few lines with my brush at the bottom of the mountains towards the top to create a little bit of shading at the bottom. And then I use a clean wet brush to pull some of the color from the bottom to the top. And for the second painting, I used a mixture of cobalt blue, viridian hue and some burnt umber. I just played around with the ratios of these colors until I got a very dark color, and I used that to paint in the silhouette of some mountains onto the second painting. After the mountain range of the first painting has dried, I go ahead with my purple color and add some trees. I use a very light wash of the color to add the trees in the background, and I'm going to be using the dark color to add trees in the front. And now I'm going to be creating the water in the second painting. For this, I just turn my painting upside down to make it easier for me, and I use the wet on wet technique. I basically use the same process as I used to paint in the sky, and then I add more tree trunks in the first painting. I also added additional tree trunks in front of the largest mountain all the way down to the bottom of the page. Then with a very light wash of my color, I paint over the bottom part of the tree trunks, and it creates an illusion of reflection of the tree trunks on the water. This is called glazing, and it is very useful in watercolor if you need to create effects like this. And finally, I add reflection of the mountains on the water in the second painting. I diluted the color that I used to create the silhouette of the mountains with a lot of water, and I just added that color, leaving a little bit of space between the actual mountains and the reflection. Once you're done, you can go ahead and remove the tape. Make sure to be careful while doing this, because the last thing we need is to rip off the paper after doing all that work. This was a pretty long video, but I hope you guys enjoyed it, and do let me know in the comments if you recreate any of these paintings. If you happen to have Instagram or Facebook, you can post your recreations and tag me so that I can see them. All of my social media links will be in the description below. Other than that, thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already. I hope you have a great day and a great week ahead of you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.